Hi folks, welcome to a new video, Writing to Explain. It's the third of our three writing purposes, analyse, persuade, explain. These three purposes need to work together in your final exam and broadly in life so that you can achieve multifaceted texts with different purposes. So we've learnt these purposes in isolation, but ultimately we're going to use them together. Let me show you what I mean. I have this text here that I wrote in response to the Video Planet task. You did this a few weeks ago and it's on Moodle. If we look at the first sentence of my text here, very happy to hear that the board is open to some new ideas. That is a sentence which doesn't necessarily need to be in the email. It doesn't convey any quantitative core information, right? It's basically a persuasive sentence indicating a positive start to say that I'm happy and this sounds good. It's a positive start. There could be quite a lot more persuasive content in here, but the task says analyze, and so I've stuck broadly to analysis. If we look, are there any more persuasive sentences in the text? Well, you could argue that within the body of the text we do have some more persuasion, but really I think we have to go to the end, to this sentence. I hope you find these ideas useful. Please get in touch. That's also not strictly necessary. What we're doing there is once again expressing a sense of positivity and a sense of constructive cooperation. So I'd say that in a text like this, your persuasive content is often going to be sequenced at the beginning and at the end, and maybe dropped in a couple of sentences in the middle of the text, in the kind of simulation you're going to be doing in your exam, which is similar to this one here. So that's fine. We bookend it. We bracket our text with some more persuasive content. And you can look at the stuff from last week. It's been the module above this video for some persuasive devices, some rhetorical devices you can use for that. But what are the rest of the text? Well, we've been talking a lot about analysis in this module, and I think in this text we can basically highlight pretty much all of this area here to say this is analytical content. What we're doing is we are looking not really at what's happening, but at why it's happening. And you see words like the underlying reason is equally clear. We have stuff like speculation. This is a trend that might reverse as paid downloads become more common. So you have lots of verbs hedging what we're saying. We have lots of hedging language. If you're not sure what hedging is, you can Google it. It's all explained. But it's basically language which makes our sentences less than 100% certain, when we're not 100% sure. And that's fine, because when you're analysing, you are not expressing 100% fact. You are expressing informed speculation based on the limited amount of data available. So here we have sentences like, we can confidently speculate, okay? This is hedging, confidently speculate. We're not saying it's true, we're saying based on the information we have at our disposal, this is what we think is going to happen. So this is good analysis. But there's a chunk of text left over here at the top. And I think that's what we can highlight to be our explaining text right here. The issues are threefold, and then we have three short bullet points. The difference when you just glance at a text between an explanatory text and an analytical text is often in the length of each piece of information. So you can see here, each bullet point is a single sentence. It doesn't go into any depth. It establishes the current situation so that the reader knows what's going on. Look at the length of the bullet points in the green section, analysis. Each bullet point is then followed by a whole paragraph. Now, I'm not saying that every single text has to look exactly like this to be effective, but it's a good sign. If I open a student's text, I look at it and I can say, okay, a number of shorter points are made early on, and I can see those points seem to reappear in longer form later. Again, don't necessarily do this, but certainly if you're not going to do it like this, then have a clear reason in your mind why you're deviating from that. And I'm fine with that, as long as you've thought about it and there's a rationale in your head for why you're doing it. We do have a little bit of text left over here that I haven't highlighted at all. What's that if it's not explaining, persuading, or analysing? Well, I'm going to highlight this a different colour. Let's make it purple. Particularly this sentence here, where I say, I'll summarise the key trends and follow up with some strategy suggestions for 2010 and beyond. I would categorise that as something you might call structural meta-language. or metastructural language. It's language which does not strictly communicate any of the actual content of the text, but prepares the reader's brain to receive that content. So here's all the content, and this is at a meta level. It's organizing your text so the reader can understand it. Essentially, it's structural language. And I think if you're going to have such a long, detailed text, then you need to set up a roadmap for the text at the start. So I'd categorize this not really as it's functional text which helps the reader understand the whole email. Okay, so there we have it. Bit of persuasion at the start and at the end. Probably some explanation in the first third of your text, and then a good chunk, maybe 2/3 analysis. That is what we should roughly be aiming at. And we should consciously be aware that we are changing our language so that each part of the text achieves its specific purpose. Okay. So if we look at writing to explain, I've put these guidelines up. You can check these out on Moodle. Once again, you're thinking about the audience, the content, and the form. Your audience, when you're writing to explain, is totally with you, all right? More than any other type of writing. When you're writing to persuade, your audience is obviously not completely in agreement with your position. Otherwise, you wouldn't be writing to persuade. Also, when you're writing to analyze, you are looking to develop your audience's ideas, not just their knowledge, but maybe their attitudes towards a certain topic by explaining why that thing's happening, the underlying reasons. When you're writing to explain, pure teamwork between you and your reader. Your reader wants to understand, and you want your reader to understand. It should be a match made in heaven, but of course it isn't, because the complexity of content is what makes explaining difficult. If you're explaining something, then there must be a reason for that. If it was something very simple, you wouldn't be explaining it. Also, it's going to be complex content in factual terms. We are not talking about somebody that requires something persuading to them. It's not an emotional problem. It is a factual problem that your reader has. That means it's all about the structure, and it's all about putting yourself in the reader's position, even though you understand the topic and the reader doesn't. This is incredibly difficult, to put yourself in somebody else's shoes and imagine, if I had not seen this, if I did not understand this, how would I think? What mistakes would I made? Where would I get confused? It requires real empathy, and it requires more thought in the planning process of your text. When you're writing to persuade, I think you can make it more intuitive and sort of just let it flow, because we're talking about an emotional connection. When you're writing to explain, it's all about controlling the narrative and putting yourself in the shoes of the person reading so that you create clarity in their mind, not just in your mind, because it's all clear in your mind. So what might this mean for our task? Well, I've divided you into two groups in Moodle. One of you are going to get this. I'm not going to leave it up too long because I don't want the other group to see it. But you see a flow chart here. And then the other side of the Moodle course are going to get this one, also a flow chart. So in both cases, the publishers of these flowcharts have decided that the best way to get this information across to the reader is not to write it at all, but to set it out as a flowchart. Makes a lot of sense. Flowcharts can make things quite understandable. It's a good way of communicating. Unfortunately, you don't get to do that. I want you to look at the flowchart, understand it, figure out what it means, and then reproduce that information in a written text. So no flowchart, but you can use bullet points, underlinings, all the regular structural devices you would use to make your explanation understandable. You're going to write that text, and your audience is going to be the other half of the group. So you are writing to a student your age, potentially your background, studying the same thing, but that student has not seen the flowchart. That is your audience. So you can really make your structure and your selection of content laser focused on what you think someone like you would understand if that person had not seen the flowchart. This will get interesting next week during our online session because I've created a quiz for both flowcharts. And we're going to have the other half of the course do that quiz, but they won't get the flowchart. They will only get access to your texts. So if they manage to do well in the quiz, only using the resources that you created for them, then you know you did a good job at explaining the flowcharts. We'll be able to see also where they became confused, where they became frustrated, where they perhaps didn't read as carefully as they could have done. And we'll see what changes you could make in your texts to make them even more effective as explaining texts. Okay, that's a good point I made at the end there. A pro tip: if somebody doesn't read your text properly and therefore gets it wrong, is that their fault or is that your fault as the author? This is something you'll have to contend with, because as managers, you're going to spend a lot of your time being frustrated because you write people emails, they don't properly read them, then something goes wrong. But that something going wrong is ultimately your responsibility, even if they didn't read the email properly. You may quickly learn that the key is to make your emails impossible to read wrong. But how do you do that? Those are one of the many, that's probably the biggest, one of the many challenges of writing to explain. Have a go at the task, put it in the forum, and I look forward to seeing the results next week.